The 9,000th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tor Wennesland.
Tor, you have the floor.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, on behalf of the Secretary General, I will devote this briefing to presenting his 21st report on the implementation of Security Council 2334, covering the period from 10 December to 18 March. Madam President, Security Council Resolution 2334 calls on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to fully respect all of its legal obligations in this regard. No such steps were taken. On 5 January, Israeli authorities published tenders for some 300 settlement housing units in Talpiot East neighborhood in East Jerusalem. On 10 and 24 January, the Jerusalem District Planning Committee advanced plans to build some 800 and 400 housing units, respectively, in East Jerusalem settlement of Gilo. On 17 January, the same committee advanced a plan for some 1,200 housing units next to Ramat Rachel in the southern Jerusalem area, a significant number of which are intended to be constructed in East Jerusalem. On February 1st, following an official land survey, Israel's Attorney General published a legal opinion allowing authorities to declare land in the outpost of Eviatar as state land and authorizing accelerated planning procedures for the establishment of a settlement there. On 28 February, the Jerusalem District Planning Committee advanced a plan for some 700 housing units in the East Jerusalem settlement of Pisgat Sev. Demolitions and seizure of Palestinian structures continued across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Citing the absence of Israeli-issued building permits, which are almost impossible for Palestinians to obtain, 216 structures were demolished or seized by Israeli authorities or demolished by their owners to avoid costly Israeli demolition fees. These actions displaced 299 people, including 138 children and 76 women. 37 structures demolished or seized were donor-funded. In an effort to reduce tension, Israeli authorities reportedly decided to freeze most demolitions in East Jerusalem before and during the month of Ramadan. Tensions were high in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in the run-up to 19 January, when Israeli forces evicted a Palestinian family and demolished their home. 12 Palestinians were displaced, including 2 children and 3 women, with several arrests reported. The Israeli authorities stated that the demolition was undertaken to build a special needs school to serve Palestinian children. Tension mounted further in February over the potential eviction of Israeli authorities of a Palestinian family scheduled for March. Following weeks of numerous violent altercations, protests and property damage in the neighborhood, the atmosphere calmed somehow after a 22nd January decision by the Israeli Magistrate Court to suspend the eviction pending consideration of an appeal submitted by the family. In developments that further reduced tension, Israeli Supreme Court ruled on the 1st of March that 4 of the families in the neighborhood would not be evicted and would be recognized as protected tenants, paying a nominal rent until a determination is made on their claims to ownership. On March 3, the families held a press conference noting the importance of the Supreme Court decision and vowing to continue pressing their claims for ownership of their homes. Madam President, Security Council Resolution 2334 calls on for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including all acts of terror, as well as acts of provocation and destruction. Unfortunately, daily violence continued. Overall, 244 Palestinians, including 4 children, were killed by Israeli security forces during demonstrations, clashes, security operations, attacks, and alleged attacks against the Israelis and other incidents. 2,966 Palestinians, including 5 women and 537 children, were injured. Of these, 2,283 injuries were due to tear gas inhalation, while 50 were injured by live ammunition. In addition, Israeli settlers or other civilians perpetrated 144 attacks against Palestinians, resulting in 47 injuries and or damaged Palestinian property. 1 Israeli civilian was killed by Palestinians, and 100 Israelis, including 5 women and 1 child, were injured by Palestinians in clashes, rock and Molotov cocktails throwing, attacks, and other incidents. In total, Palestinians perpetrated 277 attacks against Israeli civilians, resulting in injuries and or damaged Israeli property. On 5 January, a vehicle under supervision of the Israeli police hit and severely injured a 70-year-old Palestinian man in al-Khair, south of Hebron. The man later died. Israeli police officers present at the location did not intervene to provide medical assistance to the victim. Police reported that the driver had sustained head injuries from stones thrown at him by other Palestinians present in the area. On 12 January, an 80-year-old Palestinian-American man died in the context of an ISF operation in Ramadan, where the victim was reportedly handcuffed, blindfolded, and assaulted by ISF. Following an internal investigation on January 31, the Israeli Defense Forces removed 2 officers from their position and reprimanded a 3rd. A criminal investigation is ongoing. On 8 February, ISF shot and killed 3 Palestinians in a car in Nablus in Area A. The Fatah-affiliated Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades claimed the men as members. According to Israeli authorities, the 3 were members of a cell that had carried out attacks on Israeli forces, were planning additional attacks, and tried to shoot at ISF during the incident. On 22nd February, a 13-year-old boy died being shot by ISF in Al-Khadar area near Bethlehem. There are conflicting reports about whether the boy was throwing stones or a Molotov cocktail when he was shot. On several occasions, Palestinians were shot and killed by ISF, reportedly in the context of attempted attacks, including on 21st December near Mevodotan settlement, southwest of Jenin, on 22nd December near Al-Amari refugee camp, on 31 December near Salfit, and on 17 January near Hebron. Palestinians were also killed during exchange of fire or clashes with ISF on 13 December in Nablus, on 6th of January in Balata refugee camp, on the 1st of March in Jenin and Bethlehem, and on 15 March in Calandia. On 28 February, clashes erupted at Damascus Gate in Jerusalem Old City, where hundreds of Palestinians had gathered to celebrate the Islamic holiday of Al-Isra wa al-Mirja. 37 Palestinians were injured, including a 6-month-old infant and an 11-year-old girl with disabilities. 20 Palestinians were arrested, mostly children between age 14 and 17. Israeli police stated that Palestinians had chanted incitement and threw stones and bottles at police on the scene. On 6 March, a 15-year-old Palestinian was shot by ISF in Abu Dirs near Jerusalem, reportedly after having thrown Molotov cocktails at Israeli soldiers. The boy later succumbed to his wounds. On 6 March, a Palestinian stabbed an Israeli police officer in the Muslim quarter in Jerusalem's Old City, wounding him, and was subsequently shot dead by ISF. On 7 March, a Palestinian stabbed and injured 2 Israeli police officers near the entrance of the holy sites in Jerusalem's Old City before being shot dead by ISF. Video of the incident shows a police officer shooting the man while he was on the ground after having been already shot. Hamas later claimed the man as a member. On 15 March, ISF shot and killed a 16-year-old Palestinian boy in Balat, a refugee camp, during clashes that developed following an arrest operation. Settler-related violence remained significant across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. On several occasions, ISF and Israeli settlers clashed, including in the context of demolitions of unauthorized structures in the outpost, which are also illegal under Israeli law. Beta village near Nablus remained a flashpoint for clashes amid ongoing Palestinian demonstrations against the nearby Eviatar settlement outpost. During clashes on 10 December, a Palestinian man was shot and killed by ISF. On February 4, 45 Palestinians were injured, including 3 with live ammunition. Another 26 were injured on 18 February, 4 by live ammunition, including a 10-year-old boy shot in the hand with a rubber-coated metal bullet. Areas in and around Burqa village, also near Nablus, saw serious confrontations. On 16 December, a 25-year-old Israeli man was shot and killed by Palestinians near the evacuated settlement of Homesh. On 19 December, Israeli security forces arrested 6 Palestinians in Silat al-Artia near Jenin on suspicion of involvement in the attacks. 3 were later charged. That same day, hundreds of settlers attempted to enter Homesh and set up illegal structures, clashing with the ISF and breaking through their barricades. Later on 1st March, 8 Israelis were arrested in connection with these events. From 23 to 25 December, repeated raids by Israeli settlers on Burqa led to clashes between Palestinians and ISF, in which 171 Palestinians were injured, including 15 by live ammunition. On 13 February, a 16-year-old Palestinian was shot and killed by ISF in Silat al-Haqtiya near Jenin, amid clashes that erupted after Israeli forces entered the village to demolish the family home of one of the suspected perpetrators of the December shooting. On 21st of January, adjacent to Burin village near Nablus, Israeli settlers injured 5 Israeli activists involved in a tree planting activity with local Palestinians. On 7 February, 3 Israeli settlers from Givat Ronen were arrested and demolition orders were issued on structures in the settlements. On 24 January, Israeli settlers drove a convoy through Varan near Nablus, throwing stones at Palestinians and their property. 3 Palestinians, including a 17-year-old, were injured. On 16 February, Israeli announced the arrest of 17 Israelis in connection with this incident. On 25 February, an Israeli civilian shot and injured 2 Palestinian men following a car accident near Hizmat checkpoint. On 2nd and the 3rd of March, 2 Israeli civilians were stabbed and injured in Hizmat town near Jerusalem. ISF subsequently arrested a Palestinian suspected of carrying out one of the attacks. In Gaza, Palestinian militant launched 2 rockets and one instance of launching incendiary balloons towards Israel. No injuries or fires were reported. In response, Israeli forces carried out 3 air attacks on what they said were military targets in the Strip, resulting in no injuries. On 29 December, a Palestinian opened fire towards the Gaza perimeter fence, injuring an Israeli civilian. In retaliation, Israeli forces fired several tank shells at what they said were Hamas observation posts in Gaza. 4 Palestinians were injured, including a 16-year-old boy. On the 1st of January, Israeli defense forces said that 2 rockets were fired from Gaza and landed off coast of Israel. In response, Israeli forces conducted airstrikes against what they said were militant facilities in Gaza. No injuries were reported. Madam President, Security Council Resolution 2334 calls for the parties to refrain from acts of provocation, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. Some Palestinian and Israeli officials continued to engage in such activity during the reporting period. In a highly provocative move in CHRI in East Jerusalem, at the height of the tension over the potential eviction, a far-right member of the Israeli Knesset set up makeshift office in the neighborhood. Several members of Knesset visited the neighborhood, expressing support for him, while others encouraged his inflammatory actions. In separate statements, the same member of Knesset also expressed hope that Palestinian hunger strikers would die and that any Palestinian who throws a stone get a bullet in his head. In the wake of the killing of 3 Palestinians by ISF in Nablus, Fatah social and media pages encouraged Palestinians to increase confrontation with Israel. Hamas also calls for increased clashes with Israeli forces throughout the occupied West Bank. Some PA officials denied the Jews' connection to the region and to the holy sites in Jerusalem. Madam President, Resolution 2334 reiterates call for the Middle East Quartet for affirmative steps to be taken immediately to reverse negative trends on the ground that are imperiling the two-state solution. The reporting period witnessed some progress on civil and economic steps with instances of high-level official engagement. On 27 December, the state of Qatar announced that it had signed an agreement with the Palestinian Authority and the Gaza Electricity Distribution Corporation to advance construction of natural gas pipeline from Israel to Gaza. The pipeline aims to increase electricity generation at the Gaza power plant. In Gaza, during the reporting period, the Israeli authorities authorized issuing permits for some 12,000 Palestinian merchants and traders. In January, the daily movement of workers, traders, and business people through the Erez crossing was the highest since the tightening of the Israeli closure in Gaza in 2007. In February, technical trilateral meetings on the Gaza reconstruction mechanism between PA and government of Israel and the UN resumed, with steps identified to improve the mechanism. In a welcome development, white cement, long deemed a dual-use material, began entering Gaza without any special monitoring. There was a marked increase in the movement of goods out of Gaza in recent months, peaking in January with over 900 truckloads passing through the Kerem Shalom crossing to the West Bank, Israel, and other countries. This is the highest monthly figure recorded since 2007, and it comes close to the rate that had existed prior to it, as well as significantly above pre-May 2021 rates. The UN continues to highlight to the Israeli government priority items to enter Gaza, largely for United Nations health, water and sanitation and other projects, some requested over a year ago. Significant delays in approvals, including dual-use materials under the DRM, impact all aspects of UN operations in Gaza, the economy, and the lives of ordinary people in the Strip. With funding from Qatar, the gradual reconstruction of housing units totally destroyed during the May 2021 escalation, to date some 150 households has begun. Meanwhile, UNRWA has completed the repair of nearly 7,000 housing units, and is currently working with 700 families whose homes were totally demolished. On 28 December, UNRWA announced the start of a cash assistance allocation of US $8.2 million to families whose homes have been damaged during the May 2021 escalation. In the occupied West Bank, some actions by the Israeli authorities have contributed to some reductions in tension. On 11 December, the Palestinian Central Election Commission conducted the first phase of local council election in several hundred small communities in the West Bank, with over 66% of eligible voters participating. On 12 January and 17 February, The CEC concluded voters registration and candidate nomination periods for the second phase of the local council election scheduled for 26 March. However, on 17 January, the Palestinian cabinet postponed local council elections in Gaza. From 6 to 9 February, the Palestinian Central Council met for the first time since 2018, electing a new leadership for the Palestinian National Council and new members for vacant positions of the PLO Executive Committee. In its final statement, the PCC called for a halt to security coordination and the suspension of the recognition of Israel until it recognizes the Palestinian state based on June 67 lines and halt settlements activity, reiterating decisions from previous PCC meetings. Madam President, in its resolution 2334, the Security Council called upon all states to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. No such steps were taken during the reporting period. Resolution 2334 also called upon all parties to continue inter alia to exert collective efforts to launch credible negotiations. On 14 January, the envoys of the Middle East Quartet met virtually to discuss the latest political developments and the situation on the ground. On 19 February, the foreign ministers of Egypt, France, Germany, and Jordan met in Munich and expressed their commitment to support all efforts to achieve a comprehensive peace on the basis of the two-state solution in accordance with international law, relevant UN resolution, and agreed parameters. On 9 March, the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Palestinian foreign ministers met on the margin of the ministerial meeting of the League of Arab States in Cairo to discuss efforts to launch negotiations aimed at reaching a comprehensive and just settlement of the conflict. Madam President, in closing, allow me to share the Secretary General's observations concerning implementation of the provisions of Security Council Resolution 2334 during the reporting period. I remain deeply concerned by the continued settlement advancement by Israel in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Settlement expansions continue to fuel violence in the OPT, further entrenching the occupation, undermining the right of Palestinian people to self-determination and independent statehood, and eroding the possibility for establishing a continuous and viable Palestinian state. Some 670,000 Israeli citizens currently reside in over 130 illegal settlements and over 100 outposts in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. I am particularly concerned about the increasing settlement advancement in and around East Jerusalem. Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of United Nations resolutions and international law, and are a serious impediment to peace. I urge the government of Israel to cease all settlement activities immediately. The continued demolitions and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures, including internationally funded humanitarian projects, remain deeply concerning. Demolitions affect not only residential structures, but also those related to income generation and the provisions of essential services. I call upon the government of Israel to end the demolition of Palestinian-owned property and the forcible displacement and eviction of Palestinians in line with its obligation under international humanitarian and international human rights law. I remain particularly concerned by the potential eviction of several families from homes they have lived in for decades in Sheikh Jarrah and in the Silvan neighborhood of occupied East Jerusalem. Many legal cases initiated by settler organizations invoke an Israeli law by which Israelis, but not Palestinians, may claim land they owned prior to 1948. I note Israel court rulings during the reporting period, which have postponed and suspended such evictions, contributing to a reduction in tension on the ground. As demonstrated in recent weeks, forced evictions, especially in such politically sensitive areas, can trigger dangerous tensions and violence. Demolitions and eviction entail numerous human rights violations and raise concern about the risk of forcible transfers. I'm deeply troubled by the continued loss of life and injuries, including of children in the OPT, and the overall deterioration of the security situation, including an apparent increase in shooting attacks during the reporting period. The possible excessive use of force by Israeli security forces continue to raise serious concerns, particularly the use of live ammunition. Security forces must exercise maximum restraints and use lethal forces only when it's strictly unavoidable in order to protect life. I'm particularly appalled by the children continue to be injured and killed. Children should never be targeted of violence or put in harm's way. I urge Israeli authorities to conduct thorough, prompt, effective and transparent investigations into these killings and injuries. I remain deeply concerned by the level of settler-related violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Israel, the occupying power, has an obligation to protect the Palestinian population there against all acts of threats and violence and to ensure as far as possible public order and life. I'm also deeply concerned by attacks by Palestinians against Israeli civilians. I underscore that all perpetrators of violence must be held accountable and swiftly brought to justice. I am particularly alarmed by the high number of arrests by ISF of Palestinians, including of children, particularly in the occupied East Jerusalem. I am concerned that the arrest, in particular of children, may represent a disproportionate response of the offences alleged committed. Under international law, the arrest and detention of children should be used only as a last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time. I urge all sides to refrain from actions that could further escalate the situation across the OPT, and I call on all politicians, religious and community leaders to help reduce tension, particularly in Jerusalem. I'm deeply concerned that at a highly sensitive moment on the ground, officials on both sides continue to stoke tension and take actions that have potential to provoke a more deadly violence. Acts of terror, violence and incitement must be clearly and unequivocally condemned by all. Officials on all sides have a responsibility to avoid any actions that may escalate tension. Palestinians continue to suffer in Gaza under Hamas rule and under continued Israeli closures. I welcome the parties' recent engagement on easing access, including for workers from Gaza and the West Bank, into the Israeli labor market. I am encouraged by the growing volume of goods exiting Gaza, which clearly surpasses previous years. Nevertheless, more significant steps are needed to see durable economic benefits. I hope the resumption of technical-level trilateral meetings of the DRM will facilitate reconstruction and much-needed development projects leading to reduced aid dependency. The fiscal condition of the Palestinian Authority remains precarious. Revenues are not keeping pace with expenditures, leading to accumulated debt, and investments in important sectors, including health, education, and infrastructure, are insufficient. To address the root causes of the recurring financial crisis, PA internal reforms and improvements in the economic relationship between Israel and PA are needed, alongside donor support. To this end, I welcome current work of the IMF mission to support the PA's important work on fiscal stability and reform. The UN is grateful to all donors who continue to support UNRWA's crucial work. I'm concerned as UNRWA will already face critical cash flow challenges in the coming 3 months. Any reduction or disruption of services has the potential to trigger significant humanitarian, political, and security consequences impacting the broader region. As Muslims in the region start the holy month of Ramadan, I appeal to all donors to advance as much as possible disbursement of confirmed pledges. Preserving UNRWA services is a joint responsibility for all member states. As we endeavor to support the critical needs of the Palestinians across the OPT, it is also vital that we continue working towards advancing inter-Palestinian unity, as it is central to advancing a two-state solution. The UN stands firm in its support of Egyptian-led inter-Palestinian reconciliation efforts. The holding of general elections in the OPT would be a crucial step towards Palestinian unity, giving renewed legitimacy to national institutions, including democratically elected parliament and government in Palestine. Madam President, in closing, let me add that we have regrettably seen little progress on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334 since its adoption in December 2016. On the contrary, the absence of a meaningful peace process to end the Israeli occupation and resolve the conflict is fueling a dangerous deterioration that is destabilizing the situation across the OPT. In just a week, as Ramadan begins, thousands of Muslims will come to pray at the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, with the Jewish and Christian faithful following soon after to mark Pesach and Easter in April. This should be a time of peaceful reflection, prayer, and celebration for all religions. Provocation must be avoided. Leaders on all sides have a critical role to play in ensuring calm. We must keep in sight, in line with the relevant UN resolutions, international law, and bilateral agreements, the vision of an end to the occupation and of two states, Israel and an independent, democratic, continuous, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security, within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. I remain actively engaged in advancing these efforts with my counterparts in the Middle East Quartet, key regional partners, and Israel and Palestinian leaders. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Vincent for his briefing, and I now give the floor to the members of the Council who would like to deliver statements, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and welcome back. Thank you, Special Coordinator Winsland, for your briefing. We fully support your continued and close engagement with all parties to promote dialogue and peace. The United States remains committed to widening relations between Israel and its neighbors. One way we can do that is by deepening cooperation among the participants in the Abraham Accords and other countries that have normal relations with Israel. On that front, we are encouraged by Israeli IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kahavi's meetings in Bahrain with his counterpart, and we welcome the meeting between Turkish President Erdogan and Israeli President Herzog in Ankara. These visits demonstrate that good faith engagement can build mutual confidence and create a path toward a greater security and prosperity. In addition to these visits, we welcome the efforts by the signatories of recent normalization agreements to bolster their relationships through working groups and initiatives. These will help further develop trade, cultural, and people-to-people ties and offer new opportunities and hope for people across the region. The United States also believes that normalization agreements can enhance regional cooperation. But let me be clear, normalization is not a substitute for serious engagement between Israelis and Palestinians. That is why the Biden administration has made a point of intensifying dialogue with both Israeli and Palestinian leaders. Deputy Assistant Secretary Hadi Amir just visited Israel and the West Bank to discuss Israeli-Palestinian relations. He highlighted the need to improve the quality of life for Palestinians in tangible ways and reaffirmed that Israelis and Palestinians alike deserve equal measures of security, freedom, and prosperity. We encourage all those who look for peace in the Middle East to commit to constructive acts that help Palestinians and Israelis coexist and prosper. While we work toward long-term peace, we also remain deeply concerned about present-day tensions, including violence in the West Bank and in and around Jerusalem. The United States strongly condemns the recent terrorist attacks in the Old City that injured 2 Israeli policemen. And once again, we deplore continuing attacks by Israeli settlers on ordinary Palestinians. We urge the authorities both to condemn acts of violence and to fairly pursue justice for these acts. Individuals, regardless of who they are or where they come from, who commit unlawful acts of violence should be held accountable. As the Holy Week of Ramadan and the Passover and Easter holidays approach, we must aspire to peace, recognizing the heightened religious sensitivities during this time. All sides must refrain from unilateral actions that exacerbate tensions and undercut efforts to advance a negotiated 2-state solution. In that spirit, we welcome the recent meetings between Jordan's King Abdullah II and Foreign Minister Lapid and reiterate the importance of holding the status quo on the Holy Esplanade. I'll close by noting that the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains serious. Humanitarian relief, reconstruction, and recovery needs are acute, and food insecurity could worsen in the coming weeks due to the rising price of food, fuel, and other commodities. In this dangerous environment of scarcity, we encourage all member states to provide assistance, including through UNRWA, to help meet the needs of vulnerable Palestinians in Gaza. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President, and thank you to Special Coordinator Vennesland for your comprehensive report. We share your concern about tensions in East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank. With Ramadan, Pesach, and Easter coinciding in April, it is imperative to avoid a new escalation of violence. Israelis and Palestinians deserve to live in security. The integrity of the holy sites and the historic status quo in Jerusalem must be upheld and fully respected. We also call for respect for the rights of Palestinians, including their right to peacefully protest. We are especially concerned about children being victims of violence and threats, as well as the arrests of Palestinian children. Among the significant drivers of conflict are Israeli settlements activities, house demolition, and evictions. We welcome the decision by the Israeli Supreme Court to terminate eviction orders against 4 Palestinian families living in Sheikh Jarrah. However, long-term solutions are needed, and all evictions in East Jerusalem must be halted indefinitely. We would also like to highlight the situation in Masa Feryata, where Israeli authorities are planning to demolish several Palestinian villages to establish a firing zone for military training. If implemented, this plan would displace around 1,300 individuals who have lived in this area for generations. We urge Israel to refrain from carrying out this plan. And I reiterate that all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition of occupied areas are in violation with international humanitarian law. So let me again highlight that the establishment of Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territory, including in East Jerusalem, constitute a flagrant violation of international law. President, regarding Gaza, we are encouraged to see a more stable situation. The lifting of Israeli restrictions and relative calm from all sides have contributed positively. We encourage Israel to continue the easing of restrictions, allowing for more trade and increasing the number of work permits for Palestinians. The ultimate goal must be the total lifting of the blockade. We look forward to the second round of local elections being held across West Bank on March 26. The mobilization around these elections shows that Palestinians want democracy. Norway will continue to support to the Central Election Commission. Furthermore, the Palestinian Authority must be strengthened and its governance spread across Palestine. The economy must be allowed to flourish. Finally, President, let me affirm Norway's commitment to a political horizon and a negotiated two-state solution. Even while Ukraine dominates the headlines and the agenda of this Council, and for a good reason, we cannot abandon other ongoing crises. We must continue to work for a long-term solution, one which will benefit both Israelis and Palestinians. Finding a political solution to the conflict is not only essential for Israel and Palestine, but for the whole region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Tor, for your report on the situation in the OPT, including on the implementation of Resolution 2334. Madam President, the Special Coordinator's briefing highlights the increase in violence in the occupied West Bank, including in East Jerusalem, at this particularly sensitive time. Ireland reaffirms our view that violence against civilians must cease. In our last statement to the Council, we expressed our deep concern at continued reports of the use of excessive force by Israeli security forces, leading to the killing and injuring of Palestinians, including children. Such acts have continued in the weeks since then. These killings shatter families and communities and take us ever further away from the possibility of a just and lasting peace. There must be accountability for the actions of the Israeli security forces. Ireland also urges the Palestinian Authority to protect and uphold the human rights of Palestinians under its control and enhance its efforts to prevent terrorism. As Tor has made clear, the PA urgently needs international support in this regard. In the run-up to the upcoming religious holidays, Ireland calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and avoid escalation so that these holidays can be safely and appropriately marked by all. We echo the Special Coordinator's statement of 8th of March, in which he called on political, religious and community leaders from all sides to reject violence and speak up against those who try to inflame the situation. We welcome the recent visit by Foreign Minister Lapid to Amman and reiterate our call for the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem to be upheld, bearing in mind the special and historic role of Jordan as the custodian of the Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. Madam President, in keeping with Ireland's consistent position on respect for international law, we reiterate our call on Israel to halt all settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territory, including in East Jerusalem and in Area C of the West Bank. Such settlement activity is a flagrant violation of international law. Further settlement expansion plans, such as those for E1, Givat Hamatos and Atarot, would severely undermine the possibility of establishing a viable and contiguous Palestinian state. Tor, Your report highlights ongoing Israeli demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures, some funded by donors, including by Ireland and our EU partners. These acts are contrary to Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law and must cease. Ireland remains particularly concerned about the Palestinian families who remain threatened with eviction from their homes, including in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, despite recent positive developments. Israel must also address the enormous difficulties experienced by Palestinians seeking to obtain Israeli-issued building permits. Madam President, children continue to endure the worst of this conflict. We are appalled that 4 children have been killed by Israeli forces in just over 1 month, and that many others have experienced detention and violence. Israel must uphold international standards for justice for juveniles. We call for an end to the administrative detention of children and any form of ill treatment in detention. Children must never be the target of violence or put in harm's way. Ireland reiterates our concern at the designation of 6 Palestinian NGOs as terrorist organisations. Ireland's support for civil society is steadfast, and we recall the critical role it plays in promoting international law, peace, human rights and democratic values. Madam President, as a strong supporter of UNRWA, Ireland renews our call on the international community, including countries in the region, to step up efforts to support the agency. This is essential for the provision of vital services to Palestinian refugees, as well as for regional stability. We commend UNRWA and the UN family for their continued work in the Gaza Strip, where the blockade continues to hamper reconstruction efforts. We acknowledge recent positive steps by Israel in this context and commend Egypt and Qatar's ongoing contribution. However, more must be done. We renew our call for Israel to end its illegal blockade of Gaza in line with Resolution 1860. Finally, Madam President, this Council must redouble its efforts to address the root causes of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The situation on the ground, including ongoing settlement expansion by Israel, continues to erode the basis for an agreed solution. In the absence of meaningful political progress and in the context of a climate of impunity and denial of basic rights, disillusionment is taking hold, especially amongst young people. The role that youth can play in bringing about a peaceful resolution to the conflict cannot be overstated. This Council must recommit to the imperative of a two-state solution in line with Resolution 2334 as the only way to guarantee a stable, sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Glad to see you back. I thank Mr. Wensland for the updates brought to the Council. Brazil regrets that once more we hear reports of daily violence, unilateral actions, and heated rhetoric that undermine the prospects of viable and lasting peace in the Middle East. Mounting tensions, especially in the West Bank and Jerusalem, days before the start of Ramadan, are very concerning. Brazil once more echoes the call of the UN Special Coordinator upon all parties to exercise maximum restraint and refrain from actions and provocations that fuel those tensions, particularly nearly sacred sites during religious holidays. All parties must urgently focus on de-escalation. We also remind all parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. Civilians must never be the deliberate target of attacks. Children, who are particularly vulnerable in any conflict, should always be kept out of harm's way. Intra-Palestinian reconciliation is essential for peace, and the current economic and fiscal crisis worsens the prospect of political unity and stability. Free, fair, and transparent general elections should be held as soon as possible to renew the democratic legitimacy of Palestinian institutions. International cooperation aiming at the recovery and improvement of basic infrastructure and economic empowerment of Palestinian population, can also improve the prospects of reconciliation. We must not forget that poverty and political instability constitute fertile ground to extremist forces. In the meanwhile, humanitarian aid must continue to flow in a predictable, responsible, and regular way to cover the basic needs of refugees who continue to rely heavily on UNRWA's work. The financial sustainability of the agency is more worrisome in a scenario of competing efforts to help the growing number of refugees worldwide. We continue to be committed to UNRWA's valuable work. I reiterate Brazil's long-standing commitment to the achievement of a just and sustainable peace in the Middle East, with Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security in two democratic, prosperous, and sovereign states within secure and international recognized borders. But without a horizon for direct talks, faith in peace wanes with each passing day. Brazil supports Mr. Wainsland's willingness to re-engage key stakeholders, including Middle East Quartet, and to try new ideas with the aim of building trust and confidence among the parties in order to advance the implementation of relevant resolutions of this Council. Brazil will support any genuine effort to rethink the peace process, diplomatic initiatives that contribute to move us away from the current stalemate as long as in line with international law and truly aimed at sustainable peace. Madam President, only a situation that is acceptable to all sides will be able to pave the way for sustainable peace in the Middle East. This Council must reflect on the role it should play in reinvigorating the region's peace process, in paving the way for a new direct negotiations. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, I thank the Special Coordinator for his briefing. France is very worried by high tensions in the occupied Palestinian territories. The approach of religious holidays gives us grounds to fear a sharp deterioration of the situation and an escalation similar to the one in May last year. France endorses the Special Coordinator's call for restraint and for refraining from any provocation or incitement to violence. The measures that Israel has taken to reduce tensions are welcome, but they could be considerably extended to prevent a new cycle of violence. This will involve a permanent halt to demolitions and evictions, in particular in East Jerusalem. This will also involve strict respect for the status quo of holy places and the proportionate use of force by the Israeli forces. Lastly, this will require the end of settlement expansion. After several months of a de facto freeze, the resumption of planning and expansion projects since October is worrying. France will never compromise on Israel's security and condemns firmly any rocket attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call for the immediate implementation of all provisions of Resolution 2334. There is an urgent need to reverse these negative trends and to create the conditions needed for the resumption of negotiations between the parties. France calls for heightened cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, which will allow for the implementation of confidence-building measures that will benefit the populations. In parallel, there is a need to work to restore a political horizon that can give people back hope and avoid violence being chosen due to a lack of other options by default. And we rely on the United Nations to this end. The two-state solution, with two states having Jerusalem as their capital, is the only one that will allow for a just and lasting peace in the region, responding to the legitimate aspirations of the Israeli and Palestinian peoples. France will not recognize any change to the 1967 lines other than that agreed between the parties themselves. We recall the obligation incumbent upon all states to distinguish in their dealings between the territory of Israel and the occupied territories in accordance with Resolution 2334. France implements this differentiation policy through specific measures that have been adopted at the European level. France will continue to provide determined support to Palestinian civil society and for the consolidation of the rule of law. We will remain vigilant as to the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in territories controlled by the Palestinian authorities. We call in particular for light to be shed on the death of Nizar Banat and for appropriate measures to be taken to ensure that a similar incident does not take place again in future. What's more, the designation of 6 Palestinian NGOs as terrorist organizations by Israel are very worrying. France intends to continue to lend them its support. We will continue to work to preserve the humanitarian space, particularly in Gaza, and in this regard we reiterate our full support for UNRWA. Madam President, the fragility of the situation in the Palestinian territories once again demonstrates the importance of this Council remaining mobilized. We encourage the members of this Council to play an active role in support for the resumption of the peace process and the implementation of the resolutions of this Council. It is a question of our credibility. France will remain firm in its defense of the principles of international law, which it promotes on a constant basis. This is the spirit of the continued engagement of Minister Le Drian in support of the two-state solution with Jerusalem as capital. Thank you.
أشكر ممثل فرنسا على بيانه.
I thank the representative of France, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Thank you, Madam President. We thank the UN Special Coordinator on the Middle East, Tor Wennesland, for his thorough briefing on the state of affairs in the Middle East peace process in the context of the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. We listened with concern to your report on the continued stagnation of the settlement process in the Middle East and its central unresolved problem, the Palestinian question. We are forced to note with regret that around the Palestinian-Israeli confrontation, violence is not abating, a violence that is leading to victims on both sides and which could spill over into a fully-fledged military escalation, the likes of which we have repeatedly witnessed. The situation is further exacerbated by the unlawful unilateral actions of Israel, which could have dangerous, turbulent consequences for the entire Middle East region. These include confiscation of Palestinians' lands and forced eviction, the demolition of property, illegal settlement building, and attempts to change the historic status quo of holy places. We were deeply concerned by Tel Aviv's announcement of plans to expand settlement building activity on the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. The continuation of settlement building and the intention to double by 2026 the number of Israelis living in the Jordan River Valley, as well as in the Syrian Golan Heights, could be seen as the de facto annexation of a large part of occupied Palestinian territory. Against this backdrop, we are seeing a sharp growth in settler attacks and also the disproportionate use of force by Israeli soldiers against Palestinians, which is leading to civilian deaths and injuries. An example of such wrongful actions were the high-profile eviction and demolition in January in Sheikh Jarrah, in the Sheikh Jarrah district of eastern Jerusalem. In these circumstances, we believe that the primary aim is to achieve the lasting stabilization of the situation, with the parties refraining from provocations and unilateral steps to create irreversible facts on the ground, as well as the recreation of a political horizon to reinvigorate the peace process within the agreed internationally recognized parameters, which include UN Security Council resolutions, the Madrid Principles, and the Arab Peace Initiative. We do not agree with those who believe that this basis is not relevant. The problem isn't in this basis itself, because the final details of it will in any case need to be discussed by Palestinians and Israelis during direct negotiations. Rather, the problem lies in factors that prevent the resumption of the negotiating process. In this context, we are convinced of the need to intensify multilateral efforts, including in the format of the Middle East Quartet of international mediators, with the aim of creating the necessary conditions for the rapid relaunch of direct Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. Moreover, advancing the settlement process will not be possible unless Palestinian unity is restored based on the PLO and the holding of elections. Against this backdrop, we attach great importance to the provision of comprehensive humanitarian assistance to those in need in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as to Palestinian refugees in neighboring Arab countries. We support the efforts of the relevant international organizations, first and foremost UNRWA, whose work has not only a humanitarian but also a political dimension in providing an important stabilizing effect on Palestinian territories and in the countries of the Middle East. In this connection, we would point out the appeal of the agency to the international community to gather the necessary financial resources to continue uninterrupted support for Palestinians this year. We, for our part, will continue our efforts to consolidate the international consensus and coordination of joint actions in order to find a just solution to the Palestinian question. We urge our colleagues in the Quartet to consider our well-known initiatives, including the holding of a ministerial meeting, as well as consultations in an expanded format with the involvement of states in the region. At the same time, we hope that these undertakings will be supported by the international community. Thank you for your attention.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد الروسي على بيانه.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank UN Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his briefing. Resolution 2334 was adopted by this Council to reaffirm the international community's firm commitment to preventing the erosion of the two-state solution. It calls upon parties to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, to refrain from provocative acts of incitement and inflammatory rhetoric, and stresses that all settlement activities must cease. We remain deeply concerned about the upward trajectory of the violent attacks and killing of civilians. We have consistently advocated against all acts of violence. We urge all sides to take immediate steps for a complete cessation of violence. The 1st of March judgment of the Supreme Court of Israel provides a temporary reprieve to the Palestinian families of Sheikh Jarrah. However, the issue of potential legal eviction of these families remain. Tensions have remained high in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood despite the court's decision that has ruled against an immediate eviction. It is unfortunate that the provocative actions and statements have continued. Statements by community leaders and public figures should aim to reduce tensions and not incite them. We appeal for calm to be maintained and encourage all parties to exercise maximum restraint. We call upon parties to refrain from any unilateral action that unduly alters the status quo on the ground and undercuts the viability of the two-state solution. We need to urgently build on the recent positive developments and not slide back. The focus must be on addressing the urgent security and economic challenges, including the precarious financial situation of the Palestinian Authority, and charting a concrete path for discussing key political issues. An early return to the political course by launching credible direct negotiations on all final status issues is an immediate requirement. The absence of direct talks between the sides on these issues is not conducive to securing long-term peace. India has consistently called for direct peace negotiations between Israel and Palestine based on the internationally agreed framework, taking into account the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for statehood and Israel's legitimate security concerns. The UN and the international community, in particular the Middle East Quartet, must prioritize the revival of these negotiations. Madam President, India has been supporting Palestinian nation-building and capacity-building efforts under the India-Palestine Developmental Partnership for over 3 decades now. We also continue to assist the Palestinian refugee community through UNRWA. Let me conclude by reiterating India's firm and unwavering commitment to the establishment of a sovereign, independent, and viable state of Palestine, living within secure and recognized borders, side by side at peace with Israel. There is no other alternative to a negotiated two-state solution. I thank you.
أشكر ممثل الهند على بيان.
I thank the representative of India, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Presidenta.
Madam President, I'd like to thank Special Coordinator Wensland for his briefing. Little more than 5 years after the adoption of Resolution 2334, unfortunately, settlement construction and expansion continues. In December 2016, when said resolution was adopted, approximately 618,000 settlers lived in Israeli settlements on Palestinian territory. To date, the settler population has grown by around 12%. Over the last 18 months, 25 new outposts and satellite settlements were built. In parallel, more than 1,000 structures were demolished in 2021 and 2022. Violent incidents perpetrated by settlers have continued. These settlements undermine the two-state solution. They impede the prospect for peace, and they affect the human rights of the Palestinian population. Taking over territory by force violates international law. Mexico deplores the expansion of these settlements. We urge a cessation of all settlement-related activities, such as confiscation, eviction, and the demolition of Palestinian structures. We take note of the announcement by the Israeli authorities of the implementation of a truce in demolitions during Ramadan and the suspension of evictions of families from Sheikh Jarrah. While this represents a temporary reprieve, it is no substitute for the definitive halting of those activities that erode the viability of a Palestinian state. Mexico condemns any act of violence against civilians, including the disproportionate use of force. In accordance with Resolution 2334, we call once again on parties to refrain from provocations, including the use of inflammatory rhetoric. Madam President, we wish to express our concern at the fragile nature of the ceasefire and the slow economic recovery in Gaza. Of course, we note the favourable impact of the economic initiatives offered by Israel. These include work permits and an increase in exports from the Strip. However, while there is no definitive lifting of the blockade, such initiatives will be limited, and dependency on humanitarian aid will continue. This backdrop is compounded by UNRWA's precarious financial situation and the emergence of new humanitarian needs as a result of conflicts in other parts of the world. Once again, we insist on the importance for the Palestinian Authority to call elections as soon as possible. Substantive progress in intra-Palestinian reconciliation is, perhaps today, more urgent than ever. Before closing, allow me to reiterate something that shouldn't be forgotten when we consider this matter within the Council. That is, the only solution to the conflict between Israel and Palestine is a two-state solution, which addresses Israel's legitimate security concerns and enables the consolidation of a politically and economically viable Palestinian state within safe and internationally recognized borders, as well as the special status of Jerusalem in accordance with international law and the relevant UN resolutions. Thank you very much.
أشكر ممثل المكسيك.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
President, I also thank you, Special Coordinator Tor Wensland, for your detailed briefing. Madam President, Resolution 2334 addresses decades-old issues, but its objectives, while being of immediate and urgent relevance, remain largely unimplemented. Kenya recognizes and commends the progress made through regional mediation efforts and through the Quartet and Munich formats. However, despite the best intentions of the international community, little has improved in terms of political traction on the ground in line with the resolution. For example, Gaza, despite the much-needed focus and recovery efforts, remains dependent on humanitarian relief. Kenya continues to support the underlying principles of Resolution 2334. These include urging the stabilization of the situation and reversal of negative trends on the ground, which are eroding prospects for the two-state solution, where two states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace and within secure and recognized borders based on the 1967 lines. Significant steps are also needed to create the conditions for successful final status negotiations. In our persistent call for the full implementation of this all-encompassing resolution, the hope is that the desirable and obtainable objectives do not remain a futuristic endeavor. Also, in line with Resolution 2334, Kenya continues to condemn and call for accountability and strengthened efforts to combat acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas and other militant groups. These indiscriminate acts of terror must cease. We also call for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians that have tragically claimed both Israeli and Palestinian lives. Once again, we reiterate that no cause can justify the deliberate targeting of innocent civilians. The trends of the current reporting period, including violent incidents involving children and youth fatalities, increasing settler population, and clashes in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, as well as demolitions, all point to the need to look beyond the listing of incidents. Madam President, as Kenya has stated before, while the quarterly reports remain essential in keeping the Council informed, addressing cycles of conflict will take much more than chronicling incidents and events. In this regard, and as we look to the next 2334 written report in June, we believe that substantive advice on clear timelines, objectives, and frameworks for resolving pending issues from the good offices of the Secretary General would add value to the implementation of Resolution 2334. This would be in line with Operation Paragraph 11 of this resolution, in which the Security Council, and I quote, reaffirms its determination to examine practical ways and means to secure the full implementation of its resolutions, close quote. We take note of the steps taken by the Israeli Supreme Court decision to hold evictions in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. This is a welcome de-escalation move ahead of Ramadan, and more so a recognition of how such unresolved issues can quickly escalate given the events of last May. There is need for all concerned parties, in the interest of the promotion of peace and security, to support the daily dividends of constructive grassroots efforts in mitigating against cycles of conflict practically and consistently. In conclusion, Kenya urges both parties to exert collective efforts to launch peace-building and peacemaking processes that will demonstrate commitment to the desirable and obtainable objective of Resolution 2334. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam President. I join others in expressing appreciation to Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Tor Wensland, for his briefing to the Council, as well as his commitment to the search for lasting peace in the Middle East. The briefing, as always, gives us much to consider and requires of the Council a substantial engagement in support of the political processes that are required to find peace in the Middle East. The concerns relating to the state of implementation of Resolution 2334 continue to remain as we hear reports of forced evictions, demolitions, and expansion of settlements, acts of violence against civilians, settler-related violence, and provocative acts by both sides. However, Ghana welcomes the initiative for the recent high-level diplomatic contacts and dialogue between the Israeli and Palestinian leadership, and we implore both sides to maintain the momentum and engage in meaningful and transparent dialogue that reflects in significant policy changes on both sides. Despite the limited but hopeful developments, however, there are continuing situations of concern that grate our collective sensibilities. In this regard, I would like to maintain the Council's attention on the dire humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, including in Gaza and East Jerusalem, and highlight the need for urgent humanitarian relief and economic assistance to the Palestinian people. I also wish to appeal for the further easing of humanitarian access to allow inhabitants in the occupied Palestinian territories to have access to the basic supplies they require and to live a dignified life. Ghana reaffirms her belief that the path for lasting peace and stability in the Middle East runs through the two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the 1967 borders. We recognize the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people as well as the aspirations of the countries in the region to live in peace and in harmony, and call on the parties to desist from unilateral actions that have the tendency to undermine mutual trust and goodwill, which are vital ingredients if progress is to be made on the peace process. We urge both parties to resolve all differences through dialogue and negotiations in a comprehensive and mutually acceptable manner, and call for the implementation of the provisions and outcomes of the 1991 Madrid Conference as well as the 1993 Declaration of Principles, subsequent agreements, and all United Nations resolutions regarding the question of Palestine. Despite prevailing global dynamics, we encourage the continuing engagement of the Quartet and the wider international community in helping the parties to implement their obligations for the settlement of the Middle East peace process. In concluding, I underscore the need for cooperation and unified action within this Council, which is critical to the Israeli and Palestinian peoples, but also to the world at large, and I reiterate Ghana's commitment of support to find a lasting solution to the Middle East problem. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
أشكر ممثل غانا على بيان.
I thank the representative of Ghana, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President, and my thanks to the Special Coordinator for his briefing today. Let me start by once again reinforcing the need to prevent a return to the violence we witnessed in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories last year. We share concerns about the escalating tensions in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We must all work to take steps to avoid exacerbating tensions. In this regard, we welcome the announcement by the Israeli Police Commissioner that there will be a pause on demolitions in East Jerusalem during Ramadan. We're concerned about the rise in security incidents and violence in the OPTs, including the death of 9 Palestinians this month by Israeli security forces' live fire. Where there are accusations of excessive use of force, we advocate swift, transparent investigations. Israel has a legitimate right to self-defense. In exercising this right, it is vital that all actions are proportionate. We welcome the dismantling of West Bank outposts by the Israeli authorities, including Moaz Esther, Givat Habaladim, and Batir. The violence from settlers against Israeli security forces during the operations is inexcusable. Outposts are illegal under international law and Israeli law and are an obstacle to peace. Madam President, as we celebrated International Women's Day this month, we were reminded of the importance of ensuring equitable access to a quality education for all children and the power of educating girls as a tool for peace. We continue to urge the Palestinian Authority to pass the necessary legislation to protect and progress women's rights. And we reiterate our strong support for UNRWA and their vital work to help Palestinian refugee children, including girls, fulfill their potential. The UK remains focused on work to improve the economic situation in the West Bank and Gaza. We welcome the beginning of the electronic VAT pilot and ongoing work between the parties towards a more efficient tax system. The UK encourages both parties to continue to make progress on other priority fiscal issues and to reconvene the long-stalled Joint Economic Committee in order to enhance dialogue on economic issues. Finally, as we look towards the convergence of religious holidays next month, the UK strongly discourages unilateral actions that may increase tensions. We reiterate our support for the historic status quo in the Old City of Jerusalem that is the best means of preserving the right to peaceful worship for the 3 Abrahamic faiths. It is only through dialogue that we can improve stability across the region and build the foundations for peace. The UK remains firmly committed to a 2-state solution based on 1967 lines and with Jerusalem as a shared capital. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Special Coordinator, Mr. Tor Wensland, for his briefing on the latest developments in the Middle East in the context of the implementation of Resolution 2334 of the Security Council. We are holding this meeting in a particularly tense regional context as Ramadan approaches, as well as the celebration of Christian and Jewish holidays. The violence over the last few weeks, particularly in
occupied Palestinian territories and in the old city of Jerusalem raise the spectre of a risk of deadly escalation in the Palestinian-Israeli crisis. Much of this violence is causing increasing casualties among the civilian population, particularly the younger people, as was recalled by Tor in his briefing earlier. The climate of tension, exacerbated by brutality, the disproportionate use of force against civilians, and the expansion of settlements, are liable to unravel any prospect of peace and fuel the cycle of instability. We encourage the Israeli and Palestinian authorities to demonstrate restraint and to invest in peaceful coexistence while giving a greater chance to peace. In this regard, the decision of the Israeli Supreme Court to suspend the evictions of 4 Palestinian families from the sensitive Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem sets the tone for an easing of tensions. Beyond the worrisome security situation, the humanitarian and economic situation in the Palestinian territories remains alarming due to the unprecedented financial crisis facing the Palestinian Authority. Without large-scale financial support, there is a risk of extreme vulnerability for the civilian population. This would trigger a domino effect on the worsening security climate. The corollary of this would be a loss of access to healthcare, education, and food. This situation would only dramatically swell social unrest, violence, and poverty on the ground. The need for trust between Israel and Palestine and for dialogue are, therefore, overwhelming if we are to see an easing of tensions and to protect lives. The dialogue between Israel and Palestine must be serious, it must be good faith, and as inclusive as possible. To that end, the recent meeting between the Israeli Foreign Affairs Minister and a delegation of senior officials from the Palestinian Authority, the second public meeting of this type in less than 2 months, is an encouraging sign. Madam President, the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict requires a rapid resumption of negotiations for real and lasting peace, based on respect for the principles agreed by the parties and the application of the rules of international law. It is also a solution based on the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people and the consideration for Israel's security concerns. We reiterate our vision for a two-state solution. This solution cannot be secured without firm political commitment and determination from the parties, as well as the mobilization of the international community, including regional actors. To that end, the recent meeting between the King of Jordan and Israeli authorities is an excellent sign. In the same vein, the role played by the King of Morocco in his capacity as chair of the Al-Quds Committee of the OIC in preserving the particular status of the Holy City as a symbol of the common heritage of mankind, of the peaceful coexistence of the 3 monotheistic religions, and as a place of dialogue and for mutual respect is particularly important. In closing, I would like to renew our support to the Special Coordinator Tor Wensland for his efforts to relaunch the peace process between Israel and Palestine and thus contribute to stability within the region. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Gabon for his statement, and I give the floor to Albania.
See you back in the chair. I thank Special Coordinator Westland for his briefing. Resolution 2334 represents a milestone in the attempts by this Council to find a way out to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What we heard is worrying and goes against what this Council is seeking to achieve. Continued violation of core provisions of this resolution makes a bad situation worse and threatens the prospect for peace and stability in the region. Mr. President, while we believe that the full implementation of Resolution 2334 is important, it may not, in and of itself, be sufficient for the peaceful resolution of the conflict. but it is a necessary step in the right direction. We therefore welcome any step that promotes compliance with this resolution. In the meantime, we oppose all unilateral decisions and actions that prevent its full implementation, including unlawful evictions and demolitions. The decision of the Israeli Supreme Court regarding 4 families under the eviction process inspires hope for the law to prevail. Provocations, acts of violence by either side are unacceptable and must be properly investigated. They add to the grievances that need to be overcome for Israelis and Palestinians to work for lasting peace with one another. They only exacerbate an already tense situation that can easily provoke another outburst of uncontrolled violence. In this respect, we firmly condemn rocket launches and balloons from Gaza. Israel's response in its right to self-defense must also be proportionate. We continue to believe that settlements and their further expansions are wrong, illegal under international law, and they threaten the possibility of a future viable Palestinian state at peace with a democratic and secure Israel. What we need instead are concrete, continued, and sustained steps that diffuse tensions and pave the way for the search of peaceful resolution of the conflict, which make a two-state solution with Jerusalem as a shared capital a reality, not just a distant and dimming hope. Madam President, we continue to believe that civil society is a vital part and hallmark of a democratic society, a pillar for fostering a culture of mutual understanding. We are convinced that it is key also to search for a peaceful solution of the conflict, as they have a vital role to play in the fostering of a culture of dialogue and mutual recognition. The uncertainty about the designation of 6 Palestinian NGOs casts doubts about the work of other NGOs and makes donors reluctant to fund their activities. This is part of a disturbing trend of shrinking space for civil society, especially in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Madam President, we support the preservation of a status quo regarding the holy sites in Jerusalem. They must serve their function to unite people of all faiths and allow us to find strength in our differences rather than reason for division and conflict. We call on all sides to show self-restraint and mutual respect, especially during the holy month of Ramadan, Passover and Easter celebrations, and avoid actions that fuel tension and confrontation. Madam President, let me conclude by saying that what we desire is not a secret. We want a negotiated and just solution where Israelis and Palestinians enjoy full and equal rights in full respect of each other's concerns and aspirations. This would not benefit only the Israelis and the Palestinians. It would bring about enormous positive ramifications for the region and for the world at large. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I wish to thank Special Coordinator Tor Wensland for his briefing, and we've also noted the Special Coordinator's March 8th statement on the security situation in the West Bank. Just like the Special Coordinator, China is concerned about the recent deterioration of the security situation in the occupied Palestinian territories and deeply saddened by the casualties on both sides caused by the violence, especially Palestinian children. The protection of children in armed conflict is not an empty slogan, but an unshakable moral responsibility and an international obligation that must be fulfilled. We call for a thorough investigation of the recent violence and for effective accountability. The upcoming month of April will celebrate important holidays for both Muslims and Jews. We call on all parties concerned to refrain from provocative words and deeds, to refrain from incitement to violence, to jointly uphold and respect the historical status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem, to make every effort to prevent the situation from escalating out of control and not to allow the conflict in Gaza to repeat itself like last year. Madam President, settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territories violate international law, disrupt the contiguity of the occupied Palestinian territories, squeeze the living space of the Palestinian people, and affect the prospects for achieving the two-state solution. We are deeply concerned about the continued expansion of settlements in the occupied territories, the growing number of settlers, and the increasing violence of settlers. Once again, we call on Israel to halt the expansion of settlements, stop the eviction of Palestinians, stop the demolition of Palestinian homes, and create conditions for the development of Palestinian communities in the West Bank, as called for in Council Resolution 2334. The international community should continue to help Palestine alleviate its fiscal crisis, improve its economy and livelihood, and fight COVID-19. We support Palestinian-Israeli coordination on economic and civilian matters and call on Israel to lift the blockade of Gaza as soon as possible. China has always been concerned about the well-being of the Palestinian people. Last month, China and Egypt jointly provided 500,000 doses of vaccine to the people of Gaza. China's 200,000 doses of vaccine for refugees outside Palestine have also been delivered to UNRWA in 3 consignments, arriving in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Madam President, the question of Palestine in the final analysis is to seek a long-term solution on the basis of the two-state solution. We hope that Palestine and Israel will maintain the positive momentum of recent high-level contacts, gradually accumulate mutual trust, and resume dialogue on equal footing at an early date. We call on the international community to make greater efforts to advance the Middle East peace process on the basis of international consensus such as relevant UN resolutions and the principle of land for peace. The Council should heighten its sense of urgency, shoulder its responsibilities effectively, and take positive action towards a just and lasting settlement of the Palestine-Israel issue. The current security situation in Europe has drawn attention from all parties, but the Palestinian-Israeli issue is equally important. The question of Palestine should not be marginalized, much less allowed pending for a long time. Recently, the special envoy of the Chinese government on the Middle East visited the region and engaged extensively with all parties on the Palestinian issue to promote the building of consensus on peace. China will continue to work with the international community to make unremitting efforts and contribute China's share to a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I would like to thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Tor Wennesland, for his comprehensive briefing and for presenting the 21st report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. Our discussion today comes as the region approaches the month of Ramadan, as well as other upcoming holy occasions for the 3 Abrahamic religions. These occasions represent an opportunity to promote the values of peaceful coexistence between different religions. As Mr. Wennesland said, we hope that this coming period will be one of calm, in contrast to the traumatic events that occurred in the occupied Palestinian territory at this time last year. We also support his call to the concerned parties to work to reduce tensions, especially in Jerusalem city, and refrain from taking any action that may increase tensions and escalation. This would also require the parties to take proactive and coordinated efforts to consolidate and preserve the basis of the recent truce. In this regard, my country appreciates Jordan's efforts under the leadership of His Majesty King Abdullah II to reach a common understanding that secures calm and peace during the upcoming period. While we call on all parties to exercise restraint, especially in light of other tensions in the region, We stress the need to respect the freedom of Palestinians to practice their religious rights and the seriousness of violating them or violating the sanctity of the blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque. We also commend the efforts of the Arab Republic of Egypt to resume the reconstruction process in the Gaza Strip and to maintain calm there. With regard to the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334, reports confirm that we have witnessed an upsurge in settlement activities in recent years that significantly affect the lives of the Palestinian population and constitute a violation of international law. Particularly concerning is the continued settler violence in the occupied Palestinian territories. We express further concern over the persistent forced displacement of Palestinians and the demolition and confiscation of their homes and properties. Such acts only further worsen Palestinians' humanitarian conditions and undermine development efforts. We support Special Coordinator Wennesland's call to halt all such practices and preserve the prospect of a two-state solution, whereby Israel must uphold its responsibilities in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions. As part of the Presidency's pledge to shed light on the pandemic, which started 2 years ago, we would like to note that a mere 49% of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories have been vaccinated against COVID-19, which requires addressing the challenges that prevent reaching the desired vaccination rate. We stress the need to empower Palestinian women in all sectors and support projects and programs that respond to their needs, given their important role in promoting stability and development, as well as the conflict's disproportionate impact on them. Similarly, we emphasize the important role of youth in laying the foundation of peace and reinforcing the values of peaceful coexistence among the two peoples. Realizing these objectives requires tapping into their potential and investing in their capabilities to enable them to build a brighter future that serves them and their communities. In conclusion, the UAE reaffirms its historic commitment to support an independent, sovereign state of Palestine based on the 4th of June 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, in accordance with the Madrid Terms of Reference, the Arab Peace Initiative, and other agreed international references. Genuine efforts are needed to relaunch a credible peace process, which will lead to the achievement of a two-state solution, with the State of Palestine living side by side with Israel in peace and security and under mutual recognition. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.